Hey guys, welcome to the Vintage Truth Podcast. I'm so excited today to get into the Bible study with you, but I need to tell you two things that are super exciting. Number one, my new book, The End of the World According to Jesus of Nazareth, is still selling crazy on Amazon. But again, it rose to the number 74 spot out of 32 million total possible books on Amazon here last week or so. And it's just amazing what God is doing through this. And so if you have not gotten a copy of The End of the World According to Jesus of Nazareth, you need to go get one right now and buy another copy for a friend. Don't pass on your copy. Buy another copy for them so they can make their own notes in the book. And also, what's exciting about this is that means more people can know what Jesus says about what's coming to the end of the world. And we need to know his perspective, particularly his very, very Jewish perspective concerning the end times. So check that out. The second thing is this. This episode marks number 499 podcast episodes on the Vintage Truth Podcast. And I can't believe I've done this many. That's a lot. But here we are. And next time is going to be number 500. And I'm just praying through what do I want that to be about. Yeah, you can pray through that with me. And if you have any ideas, hey, Jeff, talk about this on your 500th episode, hey, send them to me. I'll consider that. But it's a real milestone, and we're looking forward to celebrating that next week on the Vintage Truth Podcast. So 500, it'll be a fun time together. Okay, we're going to hop into Ephesians chapter 6, and we're going to talk about Paul and his counsel to two groups of people. There's going to be the slaves and the masters, okay? So the first question that comes up when you get into verse 5, he says, slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart as to Christ. Now, this is a very interesting passage here, because one of the things that people say sometimes, they will attack the scriptures and will say, well, the Bible doesn't condemn slavery. Well, here's the context in which you and I need to understand this. The Bible is writing, especially in this passage, and in the book of Philemon, there's a whole other slave issue mentioned there as well. But consider the context and the culture that Paul is writing to. The whole world involves masters and slaves. That's just how it is. And in those days, we tend to think of slavery as something that is something abusive and that type of thing. And that has not always been the case in every culture that practiced the owning of slaves. Some of them, obviously, yes, they're obviously horrible examples of that as well. And the whole principle of servitude, of forced servitude, in principle, obviously we believe is wrong. But there are a lot of slaves in the Old Testament, like the Jews were slaves in Egypt. They didn't go voluntarily, right? But there are slaves that we read about in Exodus and the Pentateuch, that these were voluntary slaves. I mean, Paul calls himself a bondservant of Christ. That means I willingly serve Christ. But there was a cultural context there. And what happens is that in the New Testament, there were people there that were getting saved. And it wasn't just rich people getting saved. In fact, guess what? The vast majority of the Christian church were basically what we would call middle to lower income people. They're blue collar people for the most part. I mean, there were obviously exceptions to that rule. But because there were many slaves that were finding freedom in Jesus Christ, and Paul had no authority to change the laws of slavery in that day. And so that's not why he's writing this. He's not writing this as a polemic against slavery. He's writing to slaves saying, but what do I do in the meantime? Because that's what every slave is asking that question. He said, well, what am I supposed to do? I'm a slave. And I'm a Christian. And so Paul specifically addresses the slave. Brother, here's what you need to do right now in your walk with Christ. He tells them, number one, be obedient to your masters. In other words, we would call that in this day and age some of these situations are much like employee-employer situations. You could say, well, look, I'm a slave to my job. I'm a slave to my employer. And in a sense, you kind of are if you don't have any other options. But guess what? You're going to leave that job and go be a slave to another job. So you can, in a broad sense, apply this obviously to bosses, to CEOs, to employer-employee relationships. Look, the guy who's doing the groundskeeping outside of the office complex, he's pretty low on the totem pole compared to the receptionist in the front door, compared to the salesperson in the office, compared to the manager, compared to the executive vice president, compared to the president, compared to the CEO, compared to the stakeholders, compared to the board members. Look, there's a chain of command. So you could sort of see yourself in this role. I can't get out of it because I need to eat, right? Well, in that sense, they were much like we are in that case. So what does Paul say to them? He says, be obedient, be a good employee, be a good slave. Look, there are guys today in the NBA who are signing 70, $80 million contracts, and they're calling themselves slaves. Guys in the NFL do the same thing. So you know what? Being an employee, being an employer is a relationship. It's a contractual relationship, and when you get hired somewhere, you're obligated. And if you want to call that slavery, call it slavery. But I don't think it's slavery. But here, these guys are actually slaves. Now, again, these are not people that are being beaten. These are people that are helping in the household. In fact, many of these people are managing the whole household. It would be like today, like in ancient England, they would have manservants, right? Butlers or house managers. We even have in our country today people who come in and basically run the house for the people. Well, they're not slaves, but they're managers. So some of these slaves are really co-managers with their masters. So all that to say as a background, be obedient, but notice what he says, with fear and trembling. Why? Because he says here, in the sincerity of your heart, do it as unto Christ. In other words, if you're a person who finds yourself in a situation where your job is not the best, okay? Now, doesn't mean you can't find another job, because we live in a free country, right? But as long as you're in that job, he says, be obedient and do your best. And do it as if you're serving Christ. You're not serving that master. You're ultimately serving the Lord Jesus Christ. In fact, that's what he says again in verse 6. Not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ. Guess what? Regardless of how you want to criticize the Bible for not coming out in this passage and condemning the institution of slavery, however you perceive it, we're all slaves of Christ. And we are his bondservants, right? So yeah, we have an obligation to serve Jesus with our lives. He says, not as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Not just filling in the blanks, not just punching the time card, not just showing up for work and arranging things or building things or doing whatever you do in your job. He says, in the sincerity of your heart. You know why that's important? Because we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 that you and I one day are going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ as slaves of Christ. And we are going to be rewarded or not rewarded based upon what we did for him, how we did it, and why we did it. Did you get that? So it's not just what people do for Jesus. There are a lot of people out there in the world today who are serving Jesus, and they may be well known. They may have a big ministry, big platform. But guess what? Maybe they're really serving themselves. Maybe they're just getting their ego stroked. I don't know. Maybe they are. But it's not just what you do. It's not even just how you do it. I mean, you may have great financial records and integrity and great quality in what you do. That's good too. You should do that. But guess what? That's not all. He goes all the way down to the sincerity of the heart. In fact, Paul even says, in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, this is an amazing verse. In 1 Corinthians 4, he's just been talking about the judgment seat of Christ. And now he says this. He says, therefore, do not go on passing judgment before the time, but wait until the Lord comes. He says, who will both bring to light the things hidden in the darkness and disclose the motives of men's hearts. And then each man's praise will come to him from God. So the idea from that passage is that the judgment seat of Christ is not about punishment. It's not about rebuke. It's not about castigation. It's not about discipline. It's about one thing, reward. And we are going to be judged based upon the attitude of our heart. And so I think that's important for us. I think it's important because it teaches us to always check our heart before we serve God. And, I have a little ritual I go through before I get up to speak, before I do podcasts, before I sit down to write, before I go meet with someone. And I just have a little ritual because you know what? I really want to be rewarded on the day of the Bema judgment. I want God to look and say, I like what you did. I like how you did it. But I love the attitude of your heart. Because in your heart, Jeff, you wanted me to get the credit. And I'm afraid for me to get the credit. I want God to get the credit. And so therefore I need to serve him each time that I serve him with a sense of sincerity of heart, like he tells these slaves. He goes on in verse 7, with good will render service as to the Lord and not to men. With good, do goodness in rendering your service and do it as to the Lord. This is now the third time he said this, by the way, in 3 verses. He says, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. So here's the thing. If you find yourself in a difficult situation, which some of these slaves did, he says, you're going to get more reward than the free man got if you do this as unto the Lord. And if you served Christ and not served man here. And he says here, I love this, says you're going to receive back from the Lord. You've heard that phrase, you can't outgive God. And people typically talk about that when they talk about tithing or giving offerings or sending in a financial check and that kind of, you can't outgive God, kind of thing. But here's the other principle. You can't outserve God. In other words, there's nothing that we do for Christ that he doesn't see. And God will make sure. God is a very specific God, and he sees every little thing that we do for him. And there is nothing that we do for him, whether slave or free, that it goes unnoticed. In other words, God, you don't just serve God when nobody else is looking, and you just go, what do I do that for, God says, no, I see that. I see what you've done. And so God sees all. In fact, there's a verse for that. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I know these encouraging verses that we go to here are all found, a lot of these are found in Corinthians, and they were the worst church of all, man. They were the most inconsistent church of all. But notice what he says in verse 58 of chapter 15, 1 Corinthians. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing. You get that? Knowing that your toil, your labor, your hard work, your fatigue, your sacrifice is not in vain in the Lord. It's not empty. It's not futile. It's not unnoticed. It's not foolish, but it's not in vain either. And what he's saying there is that God will reward you for everything you do for him, no matter what it is, every deed you do for him, every quality work you do for him, and every sincere heart attitude you give to him when you're serving him. So maybe it's changing diapers for you, or cleaning the sink after dinner, or putting kids to bed, or maybe it's, getting up in the morning and going to work, or doing a job you don't like right now, or a part of your job you don't like. We all have that in our lives, the things we do that we don't particularly enjoy, but we do them. And doing them with the right attitude is very, very important. So that's his word to slaves in that day. But then he turns and he says, how about you masters there? You guys who are the persons who are in authority over other people. He says, and masters, do the same, he says. He says, do the same things to them and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven. Is there's no partiality with him. And that verse there is simply saying this. It is saying that just because you're in a position of authority doesn't mean you can lord it over someone else. And it says here, or threatening them. In other words, the style and manner of leadership is going to be judged. Why? Because leadership is a stewardship. And to the degree that you serve Christ in your area or level of leadership, you're going to be judged at that level. And the slaves, the employees are going to be judged on how they respond to the boss. Well, if you're over the whole thing, you're also going to be judged. I will never forget. I've been around, obviously, hundreds and hundreds of pastors, and maybe thousands, I don't know, in my ministry career. And you can always pick up on the spirit of a man and the style of his leadership. And I've been around some amazing, godly, humble pastors, names that you would know, big names in the Christian community. And I can tell you that a lot of these men are exactly as they appear to be. They are humble. They love Jesus. They serve people. They love people. And contrarily, I've also been around some other people in ministry, also names that you would know, who are very mean-spirited towards those who work for them, who treat those who work for them like slaves instead of like brothers, who threaten them. In fact, I was boarding a plane one time, and there was a man in front of me, about two people in front of me, and he was on the phone with someone, but he was also turning around and just berating this younger man. The younger man was probably in his late teens, maybe early 20s, and the other man was probably in his 50s or something like that. He's on the phone, but he keeps turning around and, you see this jaw was set. He was clenching his teeth and that kind of thing. And so then we got on the plane, and then I began to discern through just the nature of the conversation that this man, the older gentleman, was a pastor. And I thought, oh, wow, this is interesting. So and what he was doing was he was berating this younger man who apparently was his travel aide, his companion, his assistant, personal assistant, or something like that, that the younger guy had not called ahead to the church and arranged for the church van to come pick them up at the airport when they got back to wherever it was they were going. And he was being read to riot act, man. It was horrible the way he was treating this young, and the guy was just browbeaten. He was just cowering and just felt the wrath of this man. So they got on the plane, and of course the pastor sat kind of up toward the front. The other guy had a seat way in the back. And as soon as the pastor sat down, there was a lady behind him that tapped him on the shoulder. And she said, well, hello there, Pastor so-and-so. And he turned around and turned on the charm and became that beloved pastor that everybody knows and everybody sees and that kind of thing. And his personality completely changed. Meanwhile, I'm sitting across the aisle, a couple of seats back, and I'm watching all this happen. I just thought, number one, that's not the real him. The real him is what I just saw. And he was threatening someone that he works with. And, it was a powerful lesson to me. I mean, I'm nobody, I don't have servants and stuff like that. I'm nobody, but I'll tell you this, it was a powerful, sobering warning to me about how I treat people. And I remember my wife has often told me, because I travel all the time, and sometimes I'm picked up at the airport by someone, maybe it's a college intern or something like that, or maybe it's the pastor, it depends. But my wife always says this to me. She said, just keep in mind that the way you treat that college intern who picks you up from the airport says more about you, Jeff, than anything you ever say when you get up on that stage. And that has been something that has just stuck with me. And I've done my best to try to put that into practice, to always be interested in people, and genuinely so, obviously. But that's the warning, that one of the warnings that Paul's giving these masters here, these owners, these executives, if you will. He says, give up the threatening. Get rid of that. You know why? And look at the reason why he gives them in verse 9. Knowing, in other words, you can be assured of this, that both their master, the slave's master, capital M, that's Christ, and your master, Christ, is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. In other words, and this will really kind of communicate, when you get to heaven, it's not going to matter that you were the billionaire and they were the employee. It's not going to matter that you were the owner of the company and they were the maid that comes in and cleans the office. It's not going to matter. None of that's going to matter. God is not going to treat these people that have privileged positions with any more leniency or any type of, they don't get a pass just because they were in a position of authority. When we get to heaven, you know, I'm not going to get any preferential treatment from the Lord. I'm just going to be judged based on what I did and based on what I was given. So there's a great responsibility, and perhaps even a greater responsibility for the person who is over someone else. And so again, this is a great lesson for if you have any sort of authority or you're in charge of anything, to simply be humble about it. That doesn't mean you're in such a state that you allow your people that work for you or whatever to walk over you and stuff. You still provide leadership and direction, but it's the way in which you do it. It's the person who cares about you. And you know, I was at a very, very large mega church here not long ago, and I was talking with someone in their studio. They have a studio there, and this person said, talking about their pastor, who's internationally known. They said, you know what? He always asks me about my family. He asks me about my interests. He always stops to engage me, to talk to me. And I'm just one of the guys I'm just a techie guy around here. You know, that speaks volumes as to the character and to the humility of a person like that. And so maybe it's an encouragement to you. And you may find yourself kind of on the slave side or on the master side. I don't know where you kind of stand. Maybe you have a little bit of both in your life going on. And there are obviously lessons for us all here. But for someone who is in a position where you're serving a greater company or someone else, be obedient. Be a good servant. Be a good employee. Be the best, in fact. And do it. Why? Not just because you want to produce quality work, but because you're serving Christ. It's an offering to God, your service is. Whether you're sweeping floors or preparing reports or making sales or whatever it might be, it's an offering to your Jesus, the way that you do that in your heart. And then if you have a sense of authority over someone else, then it is also an offering to God. And there's nothing, you know, in their society, there was that hierarchy that said, no, you treat people under you like they're nothing. You treat them like you demean them. But as believers, we don't do that. And so I think these are great lessons. So what have we seen here? In chapters 5 and 6, Paul has walked us through some really practical, just where the rubber meets the road, where your feet hit the ground kind of counsel concerning wives and their relationship with their husbands, husbands, their relationship with their wives, parents, and specifically fathers, with their relationship with their children and the mighty influence that you can have there. And then he says, well, hey, you kids, you don't get off the hook either. You have a responsibility too. So he addresses the children, verses 1 and 2. And then finally, in the relationship to slaves and masters, or in our world, we would convert that to being an employee or being an employer and having authority. And this applies, obviously, as we've said, to ministry as well. So these are some great advices that Paul gives us. But he says, look, I'm not done yet here, Paul says. He says there's one more area that we really need to talk about. And it's the area of spiritual warfare. spiritual warfare. And he's going to begin in the next verse here. Now, we may not do this next time because it's our 500th episode, so we might do something special. But he begins by talking about how to be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. How do we maintain a robust sense of strength in the Lord? And he says, you have to realize that you're in a spiritual battle, that we're not in a neutral universe. So Paul's going to launch into that next time and tell us all about how to be spiritually strong and how to stand firm and take up really the full armor of God. Now, a couple of things as we close out this podcast here today. The first is, please hop on over. If you haven't bought this book yet, go buy the book on Amazon. I don't know, the price dropped dramatically. I don't know, maybe back up again. But go to Amazon and get The End of the World According to Jesus of Nazareth. And in this book, you're going to be immersed into the mind of Jesus Christ through the scriptures. In Matthew chapter 24 and Matthew 25, Jesus, in what's called his Olivet Discourse, is going to give you some behind the scenes critical intel on what's going to happen at the end of time, and specifically how he wants his Jewish brethren to respond to his soon coming, second coming in that passage, and also some principles there for you and me as well, as Gentile believers in the church age. And then also, if you haven't already done this, go on over to jeffkinley.com, and if you haven't subscribed to my weekly newsletter, this just gives you all kinds of information about where I've been the past week, where I've been speaking, what shows I've been on, what books that are trending right now that I've written. It talks about the podcast, the TV shows. You know, I do The King is Coming as well, that Dr. Ed Heinzen formerly did. I do the Prophecy Pros podcast. I do Jeff Kinley Live for his channel. So there are other programs that I do as well. But even more than that, just ways that you can find out, look, Lord, this guy's got a lot going on. Here's how I need to pray for this guy. And so it'll give you an opportunity to do that. So sign up for that newsletter. You can click on that little tab there at the top of the page. It'll take you to the newsletter. Also, if you haven't gotten the Vintage Truth app yet, there's a page there where you can go download download the app directly. There's a QR code. You can go there and get. And again, that keeps you just at the end of your arm here. You can always know what's happening with my ministry. And hey, listen, we're in this thing together, okay? We're walking through this Christian journey together. And I'm so thankful for all the people who've come alongside me and continue to come alongside me, because I don't know what's next. I mean, I'm doing what I'm doing every day, trying to be faithful, but you know, God brings along things and he says, hey, Jeff, hop on board to that and go do that I want you to go to this mission, go do this assignment over here. And yes, sir. Yes, Lord, I'm going to do what you want me to do. So we don't know what's around the corner, but we know that God will guide us. He's in us, and this Holy Spirit will lead us any way that we need to go. So thanks so much for joining me for this. We're going to jump into Ephesians 6:10 here, and probably about 2 podcasts. The next podcast, we're going to do something special for our 500th. So I hope you'll join me to celebrate with me the 500th episode of the Vintage Truth Podcast. Until then, God bless you, Maranatha, and I hope to see you next time. God bless.